The junior officer declared, "This vessel is not intended for tourists." As he gestured towards the elderly man standing near the USS Horn's boarding ramp, while military personnel passed him by without acknowledgement. The 62-year-old veteran took a step back, his gaze fixed on the warship, breathing steadily. He noticed flaws that no one else perceived. No one present realized they had just dismissed the only person capable of helping them. Let's delve into this story. Thomas Hollis adhered to a strict routine. His physique, still aligned with naval discipline, allowed for no deviations. Before his alarm clock could even sound, he was already perched on the edge of his bed, his feet touching the cold floor of his modest apartment in Norfolk, Virginia. The heating system groaned as it came to life. It was an old unit, more prone to sputtering than providing warmth. Thomas made his way through the narrow hallway to the kitchen, where a drip coffee maker was slowly finishing its brewing. A navy blue cup adorned with the U.S. Navy insignia awaited him on the counter. This had been his only drinking vessel since he transitioned to civilian life. At 62, Thomas lived alone. He kept in touch with a few friends across the country, former shipmates who contacted him on their birthdays, but his daily routine was his most dependable companion. He took on occasional jobs as a naval maintenance specialist, usually repairing engines of civilian watercraft. Work was infrequent. His earnings barely covered his basic needs and little else. 3 items shared space with old maritime engineering books on his living room bookshelf: a miniature model of an Arleigh-Burke-class destroyer, a faded photograph showing him with fellow sailors in uniform on a ship's deck, and a small, worn metal nameplate engraved with USS Horn, the indomitable cruiser. Thomas polished this nameplate every week with a damp cloth, treating it as if it were still alive. The USS Horn DLG-30, a warship decommissioned years ago, had recently been reactivated as a floating platform for tactical training. Thomas learned this from a brief announcement posted on the Marina's bulletin board, where he sometimes serviced engines. The notice, printed in small font, stated, "Authorized visits with prior approval. USS Horn, Pier 7. That morning, he traveled across the city by bus and walked for about 20 minutes to reach Pier 7. The ocean breeze cut through his clothes, carrying the familiar scent of rust, salt, and marine fuel. Upon seeing the vessel from a distance, something inside him settled. The gray hull with its stark, functional design, the bow, stern, port, and starboard, looked exactly as he remembered. Above the command structure, the American flag waved purposefully, and beneath it, the name Horn was visible and faded. Weather-beaten paint. Thomas paused briefly before moving forward. The sound of waves crashing against the dock and the gentle creaking of mooring cables felt almost calming. As he approached the boarding ramp, Thomas observed young officers in motion. They were organizing a group of Naval Academy cadets, newly commissioned officers, and authorized personnel. At that moment, he tried to get closer, remaining quiet while holding a document. "This vessel is not intended for tourists," a junior officer declared, pointing towards the elderly man near the USS Horn's boarding ramp as military personnel walked past him without acknowledging him. Thomas remained silent. He stepped back, his eyes still on the ship, inspected it in a way only he could. Then he put the document in his pocket and turned to leave. It was just another ordinary day. However, that day, they made a serious mistake. 2 days later, Thomas returned to the dock. He kept his distance while observing. The USS Horn remained there, moored like a sleeping giant. On deck, men and women moved quickly, preparing to welcome a new group: cadets, instructors, and technical support staff. A tactical exercise was scheduled to take place aboard that week. Among those overseeing the boarding, he recognized the officer who had previously dismissed him, a tall young man with a serious expression. His last name was embroidered on his uniform, McConnell. Thomas had no intention of interfering, but as he watched, something caught his attention. On the pier, a man in a white linen suit with a blue identification badge was talking to 2 technicians nearby, pointed at a secondary electrical connection panel on the vessel. The technicians looked uncertain. Thomas approached slowly. The group didn't notice him until he was just a few steps away. "Excuse me?" he said calmly. That appears to be the old thermal control room bypass system. If you're using a direct connection, it might overload the auxiliary sensors of the propulsion systems. All three men turned simultaneously. The youngest simply scowled. The older man scrutinized Thomas from head to toe. "Are you employed here, sir?" "No," Thomas replied. "But if you allow me, I can show you how to work around it safely." The younger technician crossed his arms. "With all due respect, sir, we already have an engineering team on board." Before Thomas could respond, a voice interrupted from behind them. "Is there a problem here?" It was the same young officer, McConnell. The technician quickly interjected. "This gentleman was trying to advise our team, but he is not authorized to be here." McConnell looked at the technician, then focused on Thomas. "You're becoming somewhat persistent, sir. We've already made it clear this is a restricted operation. Civilians cannot loiter around military facilities." One of the technicians smirked, trying to hide it. "I understand," Thomas said, maintaining his composure. "Just thought I could help prevent an error." McConnell stepped closer. He wasn't rude, but the coldness in his voice carried more weight than any shouting. Thomas looked at the ship once more. To him, the problem was obvious, but no one else saw it. The system was overloaded, and the sensors were not receiving proper signals. He tried again. "Are you still using the original cooling system on the panels, or did you switch to the redundant backup?" "That's none of your concern," McConnell interrupted. "I need you to leave." Thomas lowered his gaze for a moment, then simply nodded. "Certainly, my apologies." He turned and began walking slowly down the pier, each step heavy the walk of someone who had just been rejected. Behind him, McConnell spoke quietly into his radio. "Control, this is McConnell. Civilian attempting unauthorized access. He is leaving now. No immediate threat, but record the incident. Copy that, sir. We will remain vigilant." As he walked, Thomas heard the water splashing against the hull, the creaking of mooring cables, the metallic sounds coming from inside the ship. He slowly ran his hand along the horn's side, as if greeting an old, forgotten friend. On vessels like this, he had managed every type of emergency at sea. From electrical failures to complete propulsion breakdowns, it was his job to fix them. And he succeeded. But here in this moment, his past experience meant nothing. The following morning, a malfunction disrupted the training simulation aboard the USS Horn. The central thermal control system became overloaded. 2 panels burned out. Safety sensors triggered an automatic shutdown of the auxiliary engines. Exercise had to be canceled, and the crew was evacuated from the lower compartment as a precaution. No one was injured, but the technical report was conclusive. It was precisely the kind of problem Thomas had tried to warn them about the day before. Lieutenant McConnell was called to a meeting with the operations commanding officer, Admiral Hillard, who had over 40 years of service and eyes trained to notice what others missed. "Lieutenant, why didn't any of the engineers detect this?" "We don't know yet, sir, and no one knows how to fix it, sir. There was a civilian yesterday who mentioned something about this issue, but he was not authorized. I thought it best to have him removed." "What was his name?" McConnell hesitated. "I'm not sure, sir." Hillard stared at him for a long moment. "The Horn was reactivated with part of its original system. The team that designed that is probably long retired." The Admiral turned to his computer and opened the ship's technical archive. At the bottom of the document, one name was listed as Chief Supervisor of the Original Maintenance Systems, Thomas Hollis. Hillard clicked another file. The complete service record opened. 20 years of active duty. Naval Maintenance Specialist. 3 consecutive tours aboard the USS Horn. Commendation for quick response during a failure at sea. Final Navy recommendation. Highly technical natural. Leader, trusted in critical situations. Hillard rose from his chair. "Find that man immediately." By late morning, Lieutenant McConnell left the meeting with one name on his mind, Thomas Hollis. He asked his aide to search through local records. There was no phone number or current address in Navy files, but someone mentioned the man had done some odd jobs at the Norfolk shipyard. An hour later, one of the technicians returned with the information. Thomas was doing small repairs at the marina next to the pier, fixing engines, inspecting rescue boats not officially registered with the Navy. McConnell went in person. He found Thomas leaning against a beached fishing boat, wrench in hand, reading glasses hanging from his shirt. "Caller." Hollis. Thomas looked up calmly, recognizing the lieutenant's uniform. He wiped his hands on a cloth. A silence hung between them that needed no words. "Could we talk for a moment?" McConnell asked. "Will you meet me at Pier 7 at 3 p.m.? Be there." 2 hours later, Thomas slowly walked up the Horns ramp. This time, no one stopped him. On deck, a small team was waiting. Hillard stood at the front, McConnell behind him. Beside them, 2 engineers involved in the earlier system. Failure. The Admiral stepped forward and extended a firm hand. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Hollis." Thomas shook it, still somewhat reserved. "Sir, I never intended to cause trouble." "You didn't," Hillard said, turning to the others. "Mr. Hollis was responsible for installing and maintaining the original system. Our engineers destroyed yesterday. We knew every power line on this ship before most of you were even born." McConnell took a deep breath. "Mr. Hollis, I made a mistake. I disregarded your experience, treated you like just another outsider. I'd like to apologize." Thomas looked at the young officer for a moment. There was genuine sincerity in his voice, no attempt to save face, just a clear admission that he had judged too quickly. "You did what you believed was right, Lieutenant." Hillard stepped forward again. "Hollis, we would like you to assist as part of the technical team. Will you accept?" Thomas glanced around the deck with a quiet sense of nostalgia. There was no way he could decline. The control room was silent as Thomas entered with the engineers. The panels had been replaced overnight, but part of the compensation system still showed unstable readings. No one had managed to repair them. Thomas approached the main console. He slowly ran his hand along the side of the structure. "This component, is that an adapted version of the original?" One of the engineers nodded, somewhat embarrassed. "Yes, the original model was discontinued. We devised a workaround, but..." Thomas knelt beside the panel and checked the back. "The insulation here is too weak. If the ship goes out into open water and constantly takes on moisture, it's going to fail again, perhaps within a week." "Solution," he continued, "is to isolate and reconnect the autothermal control, recalibrate the affected sensors, and repair the electrical bypass through the secondary board to prevent future overloads." Hillard watched silently, arms crossed. This was no longer just a technical repair. It was a reunion between a ship and the man who for so many years had understood it better than anyone. Hours later, the system was stable. All readings matched. Sensors were operating at full efficiency. In the briefing room, Hillard gave one final comment before dismissing the team. "Most of you learned by following manuals, but Mr. Hollis learned through sleepless nights at sea, when what was at stake was not just a system. It was the lives of the men inside this steel hull." Following week, the USS Horn successfully completed its first full emergency simulation at sea since its reactivation. Everything proceeded smoothly. No sensor malfunctions, no electrical or mechanical issues. The final report signed by Admiral Hillard included an unusual remark. Technical success largely achieved thanks to the guidance and expertise of Thomas Hollis. His profound understanding of the Horn's operational fundamentals was crucial to our success. Thomas read that line, sitting at his kitchen table, in silence. The printed document had been personally delivered by a young sailor at the marina with instructions to hand it directly to him. He said nothing, simply folded it carefully and placed it in a worn envelope among old bills and yellowed photographs. The next morning, just after dawn, the Horn was scheduled to depart on its official open-sea revalidation mission. But for someone who knew ships as Thomas did, it was more than just a mission. It was a form of rebirth. He arrived at the pier before anyone else. The sky was still a dark blue with hints of orange on the horizon. The sound of seagulls blended with the creaking of steel cables, and the water reflected the first lights from the dockside warehouses. Thomas stood quietly, a little distance from the main activity. All he brought was an old, faded Navy cap. From the upper deck, someone noticed him. McConnell came down the steps slowly, approaching with a reserved smile. Came to say goodbye. Couldn't miss it, Thomas replied. They stood there for a moment in silence, watching the crew organize the lines, load the last supplies, and perform the final checks. You could have stayed on board, McConnell said. The team wanted you to join the voyage. I already did, Thomas said, his voice steady. A long time ago. Now it's your turn. McConnell nodded. Thank you truly for what you taught us and how you taught it. A few minutes later, the engines roared to life. The mooring lines were released. A deep hum filled the salty air. The USS Horn began to move slowly, gliding down the exit channel like a giant awakening from sleep. Thomas didn't move. He simply watched, following every foot the ship traveled. Then, with one hand, he gently ran his fingers along the side of his cap, pressing it against his chest in a quiet personal salute as the Horn crossed the end of the pier in its hull. Merged into the deep blue of the sea, Thomas took a long breath and looked towards the horizon. There was nowhere else he needed to be, because now the ship was sailing forward, and a part of him was sailing with it. If you found this story enjoyable, please click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one.